Ron Grant coming to you live and direct from Tortola in the Virgin Islands. You're watching 284 Media. Thank you so much for your time. As you all know, the minimum wage in the Virgin Islands is up for review. A committee has been formed to evaluate that process. Today, I'm joined by Chairman of the BVI Chamber of Commerce, Ms. Shana Smith-Archer, along with Ms. Dawn Alexander Joseph, who's the Policy Analyst 2 in the Ministry of Financial Services and Trade, to, of course, update us on the process, answer some questions, and to provide updates. We'll be right back after a quick commercial break.
At Hire BVI, we're not just about business. We're about empowering lives, and that is because we aspire to inspire. By choosing us, you're supporting a company that believes in equal opportunities, diversity, and community growth. Our mission goes beyond profit. It's about providing HR solutions, fostering talent, and leaving a positive impact. Join us in building a better future, a better BVI. Choose Hire BVI, where your support isn't just a transaction, it's a transformation. Together, we're changing lives in these beautiful Virgin Islands.
Across the BVI, the fastest, most reliable, and affordable fiber internet service is here for you. Look out for Fire in these new locations: Slaney, Duff Bottom, Manual Reef, Seacows Bay, Albion, Hannah's, Palestina, Pleasant Valley, and Havers. Fiber is in your area. Call 444-4444 or visit a CCT store to find out more and bring it home. More locations coming soon.
Welcome back, everyone, and thank you so much for sticking with us. I'm Ron Grant, and you're watching 284 Media. As mentioned, we are discussing all things minimum wage review. Of course, this is a hot topic in the Virgin Islands because it has to do with how much money we take home, ladies.
Yes.
All right.
Money is very personal.
Indeed. Mrs. Smith-Archer and Mrs. Alexander Joseph, welcome back to our studios. I want to begin by just answering some simple questions. What is the present minimum wage in the territory?
So currently, the minimum wage, which was last reviewed in 2016, is at $6 an hour.
Okay, and exactly what are the conversations being had along that line in regards to the review, whether it be improved or not?
So in last year, I think it was around the November, the last quarter, was when the Minister of Financial Services, Trade and Labor, made the announcement that she had commissioned a minimum wage review advisory committee. So the chamber was invited to be a member of that, along with I think about 12 other individuals. And Dr. Alexander Joseph is part of the support team out of the ministry with that. So from last year, essentially, we've already started looking at what was done in the previous review and the report and the findings. We've looked at data from Social Security Board as well as data from the Central Statistics Office. So where we currently are is that we are launching the full public consultation through surveys for both employer and employees to give, feedback. We need to know, what's the reality on the ground, so to speak, because we know that not every job is at minimum wage. That's the first thing. So this is not going to affect every employee in the country, but we do want to hear from everybody as it relates to the survey so that we know essentially what industries and businesses may be impacted by any kind of increase, and even where the minimum is right now in terms of after deductions. If you're making $6 an hour, you're almost back to the $4.25 that was the previous rate that was there. So it's something for us, again, importantly, we need to know, our businesses are already paying above the minimum wage and by how much.
Understood.
Because we need to know, how much. So elasticity, I guess, is the word we're looking for. How much room is there in the economy to take an increase? And then looking at the timing of it as well.
And not only that, of course, its impact on perhaps most importantly small businesses.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So for one of the things we want to get into when we talk about minimum wage is something that we already understand, Ron, that it's about improving the standard of living for everybody, right? Because businesses can't exist without the employees. Employees are also the customers, so they are part of essentially the money wheel.
Understood.
Keeping money circulating. So it's a win-win for everybody if persons are able to maintain a certain standard of living from a business as well as an employee standpoint.
I want to go back just a little bit. Shana, you mentioned on the report and the findings of that. Mrs. Joseph, I'm wondering if you're able to perhaps tell us a little bit about the findings of that report. Were there any alarming statistics, anything that came as a surprise?
Well, as Shana indicated, the process is ongoing. So at this moment, we don't have a final report as yet. So we essentially collecting data to inform that report. So as soon as the information is collected, analyzed, we'll be able to give a better indication as to what the findings will be from that report.
Fair enough. One of the things that I want to make sure the public understands, what is the difference between living and minimum wage?
That's a fantastic question, and there's much confusion around the two. So let's take the middle ground in both concepts, the cost of living. Right? So essentially there's a cost to doing everything. So there's a cost to living. And the cost to living would include things like housing, your food, your essentials, things like that. And we're saying because those things are moving all the time. So you get up today, the price of bread is one price, and tomorrow it's a different price. There's a constant movement in the price affecting the cost of living. So the wage attached to that cost of living is called living wage. Okay? Now the difference with the living wage and the minimum wage is finding the lowest acceptable rate to be able to meet your basic needs. All right? So that's the minimum wage.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that would mean what employers are required
Understood.
To, at a minimum, pay any employee for any job within the country.
Why essentially is it important for the minimum wage in the Virgin Islands to be reviewed? And do we know when the last review was?
Well, the last review was in 2016, as was said, right? And past 2016, we had the hurricanes, right? So with the hurricanes, we went into recovery. And the recovery came with cost runs, right? So the increase in materials and all of that. So therefore, the $6 then was not able to adequately meet the needs there.
Understood.
Right? So moving forward, we went into the pandemic, right? The pandemic in and of itself brought in its own fair share of shocks, right? Demand and supply. Because remember, we're talking about borders being closed, persons not being able to work. So the things that we needed to get, we were not able to get them. So that brought up prices as well. Okay? So moving with all those things that have happened from 2016 to 2024, obviously the cost of living would have risen. And with that rise brought the need to review whether or not the $6 is still relevant.
Mm-hmm. Understood. Now, I want to talk about some potential impacts to the employers and of course employees. Let's break that down for instance, because as I mentioned, let's take for example small businesses. For example, if we decide it is decided that the wage needs to be increased, what impacts will that have on small businesses? But overall, what impacts will it have on employers and employees?
Okay, so I'll take the employer question because this is something that the chamber is also doing a questionnaire to further dig into this as it relates to both the positive and the negative impacts that would happen. I mean, we could go anywhere from worst case scenario where persons have to close because it becomes unaffordable for them to operate as a business. There may be cases where persons are laid off or reduced hours. But there are also positive things that may come out of this as it relates to businesses start to look at their pricing strategy. How can we maximize the revenue that we do have without passing the cost or the increase in labor costs directly onto the customer? Because I know that is one of the biggest fears that persons have, that yes, we know our buying power, as Don described, has been greatly reduced over the last 8 years since the last review. And one of the statistics that we received from the Central Statistics Office was that on average inflation is 2% a year. So prices are supposedly go up on average 2%. And in 2022 it measured at 4%. So that is literally 100% increase. So this is what persons would feel when they go into the store and feel that what I could buy with $1 essentially is no more. So this is where now, from a business standpoint, it means reduced revenue as well, because persons will shop less or purchase, whether it's goods or services, less of it. So we need to as the business community now, start to look very closely in terms of your operating costs.
Yes.
Are you maximizing your operations so that they can become more efficient? Because to be able to take on the additional costs that may come, it would be, first line of defense, I would say, would be to see where, maybe we can do some cost savings in terms of operations and introduce technology, because that also is something that where we can make your employees more efficient, but it's something that businesses now have to initiate.
Correct.
Because of how they look. So these are some of the questions that we looked at in our survey. So that's available on our social media. And we also want to know where, for us as a chamber, whether or not, again, things like we do a lunch and learn seminar about pricing strategy, because in small business, the owner is the accountant, HR manager, procurement, the whole nine.
Yes.
So these are skills now we understand that may be needed, where, they get some advice essentially in terms of, before this comes down the line, let's try to, operate more efficiently, so that if we do have changes, and even if it's only, let's say, 5 employees, even just a 25% increase, it translates across the entire business. So we can't take it for granted. So our role as the committee, again, is to give the best advice possible based on the evidence, whether this is something that needs to be done over time, in terms of getting persons to, again, being able to maintain a standard of living, and that we make a commitment now as a policy, I would say nationally, to regularly, at least 5 years, to review, so that if in 5 years' time we have the hyperinflation, is what I would refer to it, in terms of how, globally everything just went crazy, if we're gonna call it that. And that is where now it trickles down into our economy, because we don't print money. So we have to be able to intake money to be able to put out money inside of the local economy. So that's one of the things that we're going to be looking for and advocating for on behalf of the business community.
Understood. Dr. Joseph, I'm going to get to you on the potential impacts to employees, but you mentioned something just now that I find very interesting and impactful, rather, because the standard of living in the Virgin Islands, we've always been quite accustomed to a very high standard of living. Mm-hmm. While we would not want this to be a factor, is it a possibility that that standard of living could be threatened or seemingly needing to be adjusted?
Ron, that's a good question, and it is something actually that came up in another interview that we've been doing in terms of the public awareness. Mm-hmm. And if you don't, you have to have a standard of living, and if you basically fall below that, that's what starts to become described as poverty, right? Because again, if persons are being paid less than what is required to live, when we talk about the living wage. So if we were to say the living wage is above the minimum wage, it means now that you're going to be struggling automatically. So imagine now if, again, as the cost of living goes up, your salary does not necessarily increase by the same. So there are instances where, let's say, persons might change their jobs as a way to get increase in income. But from a national policy perspective, this is where in terms of what government is doing now to make sure that you keep the bottom of your society at a reasonable place. Because you don't want, this is the things that we see as a spin-off of this now again, and Dr. Alexander will talk about it more, would be things like homelessness. And that's the reality when you don't have a reasonable minimum wage that reflects how much it costs to live in a society. That can happen because you can't afford rent.
Indeed.
Mm-hmm. And you can't afford rent, food might also be a challenge. And then there's talk about food insecurity. So I want persons to also take this very seriously, as far as the implications are not just about the cost of living in terms of prices going up, but how it's going to impact persons. Because if I lose my job because businesses go out of business, there is a trickle-down effect that will affect the standard of living, and everybody won't be able to afford it. And that's essentially what we want to see. So if we know that it costs $10 to live here, and your cost of, let's say where we were at $4.25, you see that's yes. An extreme gap. So the idea with the minimum wage review is that we're always trying to close the gap. But again, it all depends on the economic conditions. Because in a strong, healthy economy, not post-pandemic, not post-hurricane, making changes are a lot easier. Not that they won't have impact, but they're a lot easier to take on versus when your economy is coming out of a recession after the pandemic like it was.
Understood.
Yeah.
And Dr. Joseph, tell us about some of the possible impacts on employees.
Okay, so one of the impacts is the improved standard of living, as Shana made reference to. So the moving the base salary by whatever factor and increase automatically gives an increase in the standard of living, right? Whether it is small, medium, or large. So there is an impact to improve the standard of living for the employee. There's also increased consumer spending because they have more to spend than they would have had before. So that is a positive impact. We also talk about the reducing income inequality. So you have those with higher salaries. So by giving an increase, you sort of minimize that inequality between where they were and the rest of the employees. We also want to talk about the retaining workforce employment, so they feel more satisfied because they're no longer struggling as to meet their basic needs. And might I add, one of the fundamental goals of the minimum wage is to be able to meet their basic needs and that of their family, right? To ensure that they don't fall into poverty, to ensure that it reduces the social burden on government, because obviously if they can't afford, then government would have to pick up the slack to assist them. So if we can find a way to empower persons by making sure at the very minimum, at the basic level, they are able to meet their basic standards for themselves and their family, then that will improve their overall standards. And then we talk about economic resilience, right? And by economic resilience mean that they can now spend into the economy. So you keep the wheels going, because the more they have, the more they will spend.
Understood. One of the things, ladies, I want to very honestly ask you, and I think it's important because, of course, the public is paying attention to the outcome of the minimum wage review. What would you say the public needs to be aware and pay attention to, and most importantly, just simply understand about their expectations of this process?
I think the first one would be that, again, reminding them the minimum wage is not a living wage. So there still may be a gap.
Okay.
Right? That would probably be the first thing, because again, once persons start to understand, I think it helps to reset the expectation. And as an individual now, again, looking at how do we have, if you have the capacity to, in terms of multiple streams of income. Again, when we think about self-employed persons, how are you going to now really start to move forward in your business to bring in more revenue, or even bringing in more revenue again to help absorb any kind of labor costs? So understanding how it impacts the overall society, because again, employer and employees are part of the same coin. They're not separate money. One is the head, one is the tail, and they can't exist without each other. So it's going to be important that employers and the employees have some conversations, even from now, based on where the employment situation might be, whether they're at minimum wage or not. Because, we understand the hardship that has existed over the last 8 years. I think just as a private citizen, all of us can appreciate that. And I remember having a conversation with someone one time where they were saying, it'll be good if you're able to save again, because a lot of persons are living paycheck to paycheck. So taking all of those things into account is like, we don't want to, again, trigger, as you mentioned earlier, where persons receive an increase in their wages and think that now they have more buying power, and then the prices go up, whether it's for goods or services. So it is something where, again, everybody now has to take all these factors into account in terms of the review is done. but what will be the outcome on the other side? Because in another interview, someone asked us, who's going to look out for price gouging? And we said to them, again, the same agencies that would take these into account would be CSO, Central Statistics Office. They do price monitoring. And the Trade Department has been responsible for consumer affairs. So, persons see issues where, there's ridiculous increases. I don't think we should not expect any increase. We just don't want to see anything that, again, it creates hardship still. So it means that this has never, it didn't bring the relief that persons are looking for. Yeah. So again, we want to you're calling on businesses to be responsible as well as individuals, because, sometimes we have to reset our priorities, and not just because we have additional money, we go and spend all of it, but that we do make sure that we're handling, what we do have as far as resources, because we are in an environment where we can't control a lot of things. We can't control a lot of our cost of living factors. We don't control the cost of oil, which everything is affected by that, including food prices, because the supermarkets have to buy electricity.
Yes.
And if electricity goes up, it's because of something else, an increase in price elsewhere. So that's integration, I would say, in terms of how the economy is so interconnected. That is not just about, what the paycheck is saying, but, what goes into producing that paycheck, and then going forward, how you're going to be able to use it more efficiently.
Wonderful. Dr. Joseph, anything that you would say to the public in regards to their expectations of this process?
Well, first, I would want them to understand that it's a very inclusive process, that we are seeking the inputs from the employers, government, all the stakeholders, right? And they should manage the expectations carefully. Not because if the results of this exercise would say, okay, we need to see an increase of X amount, there is not necessarily going to be an automatic increase in price movements. So it is important that businesses as well, as was stated before, exercise caution and be conscious in their pricing strategies as to how they're going to execute going forward. Because normally you have movement of prices when you have like the economic term supply and demand kicking in, so there's a shortage of XYZ, you tend to bring up your prices. But if the price movement is just going to be in direct response to the increase, then the encouragement is to carefully analyze and look within the organization to see what room they have and how far we can go. Because at the end of the day, we do not want to get back to the same process in a short order. And that is why this whole process, not only in the BVI but elsewhere, is a difficult process, because you're always competing with external things that affect the cost of living. And for us, the majority of the things that we get, they are imported. So we're bringing in that cost as well. So we have that as a weakness running against us. So we have to look at those things carefully in making the decisions going forward.
In making that decision holistically, when is the process expected to be completed, timeline-wise?
Well, the report is expected to be handed to the minister towards the end of this month.
Okay.
So essentially, we have this week and next week to collect the data in terms of the survey questionnaires, the written submissions, the one-on-one engagements. So we have those venues available so that persons can go on. And it's not only for persons who are at the minimum wage level. We want the participation of everybody to give some ideas, some feedback as to what's the best way we can move forward.
Also share the email address that you can send submissions.
So the email address that you can send submission is mfslt@gov.gov.
All right. Now I have to ask you, mention
gov.vg. Sorry.
Okay, so repeat that for me one
So
more
I'll
time.
repeat that again. mfslt@gov.vg.
Yes.
All right. In speaking of interaction and stakeholder conversations, the BVI Chamber of Commerce recently held a business stakeholders meeting on the entire minimum wage process. Chairman, what was the feedback? What was that interaction like?
So the feedback was, I think persons were very much engaged because we had invited Dr. Alexander Joseph to come and present. So some of the same points we've been discussing. And one of the things that came to light, though, was that persons from the different sister islands pointed out that the cost of business and cost of living is different on the sister islands from Tortola.
Okay.
So, even the question of would there be different minimum wages to reflect this? Or is it something that, a median figure would be able to take this into consideration? Because again, for me, I saw this very live after the pandemic, somewhat after the hurricane, but the pandemic was very much so evident that you have essentially what we call sub-economies inside of our economy.
Yes.
Because the cost of selling a product in Anegada has to take into consideration transportation to Anegada, right? So there's a lot of things now that have been happening over the years, and they have sort of just adopted. But it is only so much adaptation that can be done without, again, the decisions, the information, I should say, being factored into the decision. So that's some of the feedback that we're definitely filtering forward as part of, since we're a member of the committee, that we do need, again, through the questionnaires are asking, what industry is your business in, where are you located, so that we can see,
Understood.
whether or not they are already in a position to pay above minimum wage, even though it may be costing them more. Because again, some businesses, they already know that, if we're in a position to pay better than minimum wage, we do that. So we want to also see what size of the employer base is already doing that versus those that, this is where they're at based on the type of industry that they're in. So, but that for me was very interesting. And again, the fact that it was brought up, it was like, yes, we do need to make sure
Most
that this
importantly,
is
take into
factored in
consideration, yeah.
as part of, industry-wise, when the rate is increased, it's not where, you and I going to automatically get an increase in our salaries, but it is something that if your salary now falls below, on an hourly basis, below whatever the minimum wage is now, then that would have to be reset.
Understood.
So that's one of the things also for persons in terms of an expectation to be paying attention to. So even if you're on salary, calculate what your hourly rate is.
All right.
So that you know exactly what you are being paid at, because again, it has to be adjusted if it's not already there.
Got you.
Okay?
I must ask, in regards to the interaction, let's talk about the survey and the minimum wage committee questionnaire for the employer. How can persons access it? And of course, encouraging, because we have just about 2 weeks, you said,
Yes,
left.
correct.
Let's speak about those surveys.
Okay, so at the moment, the employee survey can be found on the government's website. We also have been circulating via our social groups, WhatsApp and so on, through the links. So that is also available. We intend to put QR codes in strategic locations like the supermarkets, etc., around town, so that persons can easily access them to be able to do that. So that's in terms of, I'm not sure if there's any other thing that you want to add in terms of that.
And then for us, as far as the Chamber of Commerce, we've communicated to all membership, and we're also going to have it on all social media. So
Understood.
there'll be quite a few options for persons to be able to get it.
Wonderful. Well, ladies, thank you for the very detailed and insightful conversation. Of course, as I mentioned in the introduction, this topic is of grave concern to the people of the Virgin Islands, but I thank you for coming and breaking it down for us.
Thank you for having us.
It's always
Thank
a
you.
pleasure. Viewers, that is all the time we have. Ron Grant for 284 Media. We were joined by Chairman of the BVI Chamber of Commerce, Mrs. Shana Smith Archer, along with Dr. Dawn Alexander Joseph, Policy Analyst 2 in the Ministry of Financial Services and Trade, discussing, of course, what is on the table, the minimum wage review. Have a beautiful rest of the day. Bye-bye.